History of the Mongol Empire Part 1, the era of Genghis Khan until his death. Genghis Khan was one of the greatest conquerors in world history, and the Mongol Empire he helped create was at a point one of the largest contiguous land empires in history. It had a land mass twice that of the Roman Empire at its peak, and occupied an astounding 23 million square kilometers. It would find its origin in the nomadic tribes of the steppe to occupy a land defined by polar opposites of climate, equally rich and diverse in terms of religions and cultural landscapes. What made the empire so successful, and how did it start off? We will explore these questions and begin the story like all good epics, at the very beginning, looking at the life of Temujin as well as some of the changes he would come to make. We will end this story before the end of the empire, with the death of Temujin. Pre-Genghis Khan Mongolia, a land of nomadic tribes and rich cultural history. Before the rise of Genghis, the life of its inhabitants was mostly determined by the steppe. Mongolians were mostly a nomadic people, extremely adept at understanding the environment. An environment that also called for resilience and hardiness and made a connection to the natural world, a key attribute. The steppes were a vast grassland, made of low grazing vegetation that made itself home across the extensive and massive land. It would see animals like wolves, foxes and antelopes make their life across the steppe, and contribute to the ecosystem. Herding, hunting and trade were key occupations people of the steppes would take part in, at times with the aid of horses, and traditional living depended on jes that were iconic housing structures. They were the perfect houses for the steppes, and were suited for surviving some of the harsh conditions of the various and different climates. They would be spread and sprawled across the landscape. The tribes that called the steppe home included the Mongols, the Tartars, Merkits and Naimans. Their interactions a tangle of alliances, trade networks, and rivalries. The people of the steppes were skilled and accomplished horsemen, and had impressive skills in archery. Mongolian society before the rise of Genghis Khan was structured with extended families and kingship groups being the main reference points. Tribal leaders had the greatest sway on issues of import. They could decide issues to do with warfare, allegiances and alliances, and even resource allocation. Leadership was given based on strength, charisma and ability. The different clans in the steppes were at times at war with each other, but occasionally united to fight common enemies. Trade in Mongolia had been valued before the rise of Genghis and would form a key part in his reign. Some factors that might have led to the rise of the Mongol Empire included a recent change that had occurred in the climate. It would see a rise in war horses and livestock as a result of a moderately milder steppe with better rains. A contrast to the usually drier and colder weather, this change had occurred in the 13th century. It would in part contribute to the changes that would support the rise of Temujin. The rise of Genghis to power and his unification. Genghis had been born in 1162, and his journey to the top would be supported in large part by his charisma, strategic brilliance, ruthless ambition and leadership skills that were exceptional and allowed him to shape crucial alliances and overcome some of his rivals. He'd become one of history's most definitive and transformative figures and emerge from the context of the Mongol world to influence extensive corners of the world, yet his early life wouldn't be completely free from the difficulties, loss and hardship that would define other parts of his life. He was the oldest child of Yesugei, who had been a chieftain of the Borjahin clan, and his wife Ho-Ilun. Temujin had had a marriage arranged at a young age, with his father taking him to the Ongjirat tribe from which Ho-Ilun had been born, and betrothing him to be married to Bort, a daughter of an Ongjirat chieftain. This move was part of Yesugei's plan to gain more influence and an ally. Part of the agreement that came with a marriage was a condition that the young Temujin would stay with the Ongjirat tribe to work off the bride's price. Whilst riding home, he would chance upon a group. Because the tradition of the steppes put faith on hospitality, Yesugei would request a meal. But the group, recognizing him, and being a part of a rival tribe, would use the opportunity to poison him, possibly for a previous wrong. He'd ride home, falling ill from the poison, and ask a trusted retainer to fetch Temujin. He'd die soon after. Tradition said that the Mongols followed the strong, and Temujin and his family would soon be abandoned to live a life of subsisting on the land. Ho-Ilun would play a role in teaching her family the new and different lifestyle. During this time, Temujin would become more accomplished in horse riding and archery. These traits being valued in the nomadic society. He'd also grow a following. It was apparent that when the family was abandoned, it was because they had had no children that were old enough to claim power. In the future, Temujin would meet two other key individuals. Both of them around the time he returned to the Ongjirat tribe. One would be Jamika, another steppe leader, and they would become Anders. A second would be Togrul. Togrul would have fought alongside Temujin's father when he was alive, and would have also been an Ander of Yesugei. Temujin had returned to the Ongjirat tribe to claim his wife, but at a date in the future, she'd be abducted, and Jamaica and Togrul would send aid to him. A successful campaign would follow, but the alliance would prove itself to be short-lived when infighting would result in the death of Jamaica, and with Temujin emerging as the sole ruler in the Mongolian steppe. Imperial events called Kurultayes were assemblies at which Khans could be declared. They were also assemblies that met to strategize and organize military campaigns, proffer official titles, and leadership positions and give responsibilities and roles. Though these events at most times were serious events, they also included feasts and traditional games. Mongolian wrestling and archery are some events that are found at some modern equivalents. It was at such an event in 1206 that saw Temujin made into the Great Khan, the title being given to the ruler of all Mongols. Temujin now found himself with over 1 million people under him, and one of the first changes he made was an administrative one. It would change where loyalty would be owed and saw tribal loyalties downplayed. In their place was loyalty to the Khan. Another factor was soldiers from defeated tribes. Leaving them to their own devices could lead to them joining ranks and rising against the Khan. To counter this, society was now organized into decimal units, and some of the men were randomly distributed between them. The units included men that were aged 15 to 70 and were called minikans, consisting of 1,000 soldiers. These minikans were further broken down to jaghats, and these were made of 100 soldiers. Included in these structures was not just a soldier but his household as well. The minikan was a social and political unit. It was part of these efforts that made what Genghis was building distinct from the previous steppe confederacies that had existed in the past. Another major difference that came was one that would also be unique to Genghis in part. It was apparent that amongst many of the leaders the Khan would elevate were carpenters, blacksmiths, and herdsmen. They had been born of low social status. What favored them was that they had proven their abilities and earned the titles they would hold. The Khan chose to rely on capable leaders, and was able to use different perspectives and ideas to support his ambitions. The Keshig, household staff and bodyguards. A military academy of sorts, and a source of household staff and bodyguards. The Keshig were loyal to the Khan and useful in times of both war and peace. They would be given access to the Khan, and they also formed a contingent from which he could choose to raise individuals to govern or to command. The Khan's legacy would also come to consist of the far-reaching changes he made. The Khan would move to support trade and cultural exchanges and also support the transmission of knowledge and ideas across the vast domain. He also came to make changes to the law. The Yasa was a collection of laws and customs that had been made by the Khan and would come to govern parts of society. It promoted order and justice within the empire. 1209 would see the Khan personally lead and oversee a full-scale invasion of Xia, ending in a peace treaty, and 1211 would see the capturing of Chengdu, the capital of the Jin dynasty in northern China. An eastward push would follow, birthing an empire that came to stretch widely, amidst conquered vast territories, from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. Under the Khan's leadership, several unprecedented conquests would follow at a bewildering pace. The military prowess and ruthlessness would prove to be unmatched, leading to changes that came to reshape the geopolitical reality of Eurasia, even in decades following. The Mongol conquest of Central Asia, a crucible of power. Traders were now eager to commence trade between the Khwarezmian Empire and Mongolia following the Khan's gain of control in the eastern part of the Silk Road. The Khwarezmian Empire had diverse and varied cultures and regions and was a strong empire ruled by Shah Muhammad II. It had strong attributes but was made weaker by some internal divisions, a weakened military, and a rash leader. 1218 would see a massacre of a Mongol caravan in Khwarezmian territory. The Khan would demand justice and send a convoy. The Shah responded rashly by executing the Mongol envoys, which sparked a diplomatic crisis. This act of defiance initiated and ignited the Mongol invasion of Central Asia. The rapid and decisive response by the Mongols would prove devastating. The population had been dissatisfied by the Shah's rule, and this made the large empire disunited and divided. Amongst those who were unhappy was the nobility. The Mongols were aided in the conflict by the better tactics of their cavalry as well as better siege warfare techniques and a more mobile army. These advantages would make victory more certain, which was aided by the Khwarezmian decision to keep the forces garrisoned in major cities, which gave the Mongols more freedom. Otrar was besieged in 1219, and fell a few months into the siege in 1220. The Mongols would split, with Joshi going northwards, other forces would move south into central Transoxiana, and Chagatai and Ogdi would keep the siege of the city going. Tolui had the main army with him when he went across the Kizilkum Desert into Bukhara, the cultural and commercial hub of the empire. Samarkand's fall would follow. The Shah would flee. In pursuit would be the Mongol forces, who would prove to be relentless. He would eventually die on a remote island and his empire would be left in ruins. The Mongols would end up encountering parts of medieval Europe during this time. Other cities would end up being conquered. These cities would include Khiva, Merv, and Urgench. What had resulted was the end of the Khwarezmian Empire. This led to several changes, which reoriented the political and cultural life. On the way back, Genghis would implement new administrative divisions known as Daragachi and Bashkarks. In the system, Daragachi were commissioners and Bashkarks were local officers. Impact on Central Asia's trade and arts. The legacy that was left on Central Asia was complicated and its impact on the region would be enduring. Destruction and violence had marked their conquest. But it had made cultural exchange, advances in technology and the development of a trade network possible. Life under the Mongol Empire, a well-woven story of adaptation, conquering and the transformation of a region. Life under the empire would be complex, made up of several factors and attributes, and decidedly affected and impacted by the growing diversity of the populations within the extensive territory. Mongolians would bring to front their identity and history of traditions into the lands they would come to conquer. Throughout the length of the empire, they would come in contact and interact with several different peoples, including the Chinese, Persians, Russians, and Arabs. All of them would be distinct in their own way, having unique cultures and ways of life. How did the Mongols handle this diversity? They tended to adopt parts and pieces of the local cultures and administrative systems, but kept their laws and traditions. The society was therefore made to be adaptable and able to assimilate different attributes. This would result in it being an extremely dynamic society. This and other facts would result in the prospering of several regions. Trade increased not only of goods, but also of ideas and technologies. This was aided by the presence of the Silk Road. Mongolians were tolerant of the different religions, and free practice of religions was allowed. All this added together, ended up aiding in the preservation of the variety and diversity of the traditions within the empire, and this would be underpinned by a period of peace and advancements in technology, science and art, which would result in the success of scholars and artisans within the empire. The period would be known as the Pax Mongolica. End of an era, death of Genghis and its impact on the empire. Genghis would die at an unfortunate time, which would force news of his death to be repressed. His death came during a siege on Zhongxing. A month or so after his death, Zhongxing would fall. The cause of his death has been contested. Multiple ideas and theories exist as to what it could be attributed to. Even though his death marked a transition for the empire he had ushered into existence, it also came to mark the end of an era. He would be carried back to Mongolia. Succession struggles and challenges would arise in the wake of the Temujin's death, but his legacy would remain, including the administrative changes he had made, the support he had given to the arts and sciences, as well as the cultural exchanges that had occurred during his reign. His military exploits and conquests would reshape the Eurasian landscape and make the empire one of the strongest in history. This would continue even after his death. Things had changed forever. From the boy on the steppe, left alone, to a leader that conquered vast parts of Eurasia, and whose legacy would continue for centuries and decades after. His story came to represent parts of his strategic brilliance and adaptability, and its ability to transform Eurasia. The challenges and struggles that the empire faced in his wake highlighted why a strong central authority and unity had such an impact. In short, the boy from the steppes had come to reconfigure the geopolitics of the continent. He had conquered large parts of Eurasia, and the empire that he had grown had gone on to foster trade and cultural exchange along the Silk Road, ushering a new period of peace and prosperity known as the Pax Mongolica. His legacy and impact on the development of Eurasia was extensive. It echoes to the current day. His actions and legacy, however, remain controversial, multifaceted and complicated. A combination of extraordinary achievements and devastating consequences. He remains a symbol of the power of ambition. And the impact of the Mongol Empire on the world says a lot about the impact that one civilization can have on the course of events. End of Part 1. Part 2 will look at the history of the Mongol Empire after the death of Genghis, and take a look at the succession wars involving his sons that occurred in its wake. It will also look at what followed afterwards in the region amidst the continued expansion of the empire as well as the events surrounding it. Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe to the channel for more videos and important questions.